does it imply? And when you have a disease and then you introduce a code, the ICD codes, various ICD codes. So that kind of an activity basically is sometimes referred to as disease informatics, and this the kind of activity which we are participating. The reason I brought that word forward, foregrounded it, is that to underline what Professor Jean actually made a statement today in the morning, saying that you need information infrastructure before you get the confidence to implement something like the DRG system. So you need a deep understanding of the ontology. Basically, that's a very technical term of what is happening in healthcare, the ontology of healthcare, and the ontology of the information systems, which come together to provide this kind of case mix understanding. Now, there are other terms which are very similar to case mix. For example, you might have heard words which are now made, distinction is made between the word severity and case mix. Professor John again in the morning pointed out that the DRGs have now included 4 levels of severity, but in the initial days when in the 1980s when it was introduced, it was acknowledged that DRGs, even though they give the impression that they are referring to an understanding of the severity of the condition, they actually fail to make distinctions, especially within hospitals or within that DRG group. You can have different levels of severity within a DRG, and that could be difficult to manage. There are other words which nurses are fond of using, such as the intensity of care, the nursing service intensity, and those kinds of concepts are also common to case mix. They are more or less referred to, but they're not very popular. I think the most popular term is what Professor John has selected, and that is patient classification systems. So you will have different people speaking about the same thing, and maybe the nursing would use a different idea, intensity of care kind of concept, or the service intensity, they call it. So that could be a different kind of idea. And similarly, if you go to the ICU, you will have people, doctors and nurses collecting data for doing something called an Apache scoring system. Or in the neonatal ICU, you will have something called a PRISM scores. So these are similar ideas, but they refer to different domains. And what the bottom line is, whatever you do, and that applies to all kinds of analysis, is that any analysis is dependent upon the purpose. So what is the purpose that you are after? If you want to reduce cost, then the analysis is different. If you want you want to make some statements about prognosis, then the analysis is different. That's the kind of thing that you need to keep in mind when you look at or get interested in exploring these concepts. The next concept I thought I'll walk you through while they get things ready is the idea of health. And we know that classic definition of health by the WHO, which goes beyond the physical to the psychological and to the social. So this idea of health then ends up actually defining for us what is the goal of healthcare. So the ideas of disease and health can be ancient, but healthcare is a much more modern concept, relatively modern concept. And therefore now, if you are talking about these ideas, the concepts like case mix analysis, which means you're actually participating in the validation of healthcare. I don't know if you remember Professor John repeatedly saying, first you must know what you're doing, and then you can do something about quality. So this idea that you really want to understand what you're doing, the reason you are here and not in the hospital right now, but you're still doing some sort of healthcare activity. You're participating in a certain seminar which is talking about health. So you're getting a way to sharpen your tools. So this is the basis of formalizing medicine or formalizing health. Now in the literature, it is not always agreed that health is produced by healthcare. The contribution of healthcare to health is overestimated. We are socialized during our professional training, and some of us may be very adamant in believing that health is actually something concerned only with healthcare. You might even find situations, I can tell you many times in Kerala, when the professionals went on strike, the mortalities came down. Professionals, they say, should not go on strike, and when they go on strike, in spite of that ethical dictum, they found in studies that the mortality actually came down. So I'm not in any way implying that that we have a negative impact, but what I'm trying to examine openly with you is that health actually has a value chain. The idea of a value chain is a business concept. It is borrowed from a Harvard professor named Michael Porter, his value chain analysis, and in the context of, he does it in the context of competition, but the value chain is equally applicable in the context of cooperation. And that is the justification for us to be participating today in this seminar, that each one who's here is part of the value chain. And Professor John actually pointed out when I asked him the question about, what is the difference between who are the stakeholders in development and who are the stakeholders in implementation. That idea of stakeholdership is actually the underlying concept, is the idea of a value chain, that everybody contributes something to the final product, and in this case, the production of health. So the nurses definitely have a major role in the production of health. The doctors have a major role, but what happens is, in this ecosystem, we tend to underestimate the role played by other players, which is very unfair, and maybe the explanation for the kind of quote-unquote mess that healthcare is finding itself all over the world. The problem with healthcare is not just limited to developing countries. Countries like the USA have now come out explicitly acknowledging that healthcare for them is a broken enterprise. And so first you need to accept that you have a problem before you can solve it. So in this way, if you look at one of the least appreciated people in the healthcare value chain is the coders. The people who actually translate the work that you do and document into something that can be used later as an instrument to improve the entire process of providing healthcare. And a similarly ignored or underestimated contribution is the idea that collecting data is itself a very costly affair, and it's most often a thankless job. It is only when you look at the value that you derive out of data, only when you believe in the value that can come from the data, only when you believe that data, when it's transformed by analysis into information, and that information is then placed in a certain context, and that becomes knowledge. That is the value chain in information. That is the value chain which ultimately leads to action. So the value chain would be data, information, knowledge, and action. So this idea of having seminars on something like case mix is actually at the juncture between data and information and knowledge, basically, in parts. Data by itself or the codes by themselves don't tell you much. But when you place them in a particular context, when you place them for a particular purpose, when you apply them for a particular purpose, you have knowledge, which is actionable knowledge. So you are motivated then to do something with it, and you're motivated to use it as an instrument for change and for improvement. Now, having used these terms, such as I've just walked you through disease, through health, through healthcare. Now, healthcare by itself, it becomes a philosophical study if you're only interested in the idea of healthcare. Healthcare is a practical enterprise, and therefore you need ways of defining or redefining healthcare, if I'm to borrow a more popular term, and looking at what constitutes healthcare. What are the parts of healthcare? What are the components of healthcare? And to do that, one of the most useful, and I think one of the well-recognized and most famous innovation is case mix systems. In spite of listening to Professor John, you might still have doubts, how is this applicable to me here? The idea is because that it's a problem for you because nobody has actually brought it to you in a way that you can understand, in a way that you can feel that it needs to be done, in a way that you feel that it can be done. maybe, I mean, I'm not stipulating the time frame, I'm not underestimating the kind of resources that is involved, but this is something that should have been done. So it is not just a mere question of asking in a pragmatic sense, but it also has a moral force or an imperative behind it. It is a normative question in that sense that you should be asking, why haven't I done this? As a professional, all of us have gone and spent 4 years or 5 years. We have spent, I think on an average here, most people have spent more than 10 years working at the bedside. And how is it that we are sitting today in a hall and listening to things which we are hearing for the first time? Why is there some kind of a detachment with this idea? To break that, you have to believe first in what Professor John has brought forward so beautifully this morning. So in capturing the essence of healthcare, though it can be used in various other domains, we have to look at or study what is famously, now very famous now in India also, the idea of quality. Now, quality as such, I will, due to the paucity of time, I will just give you one idea which I can use to justify the seminar once again, is that Avidius Dornabedian in the 70s and 80s, he was literally the founder of the modern era of quality in healthcare. He gave a framework which is called structure, process, and outcome. My economists have always used that input-output. So Dornabedian's framework is a very interesting framework, because when you go back to your workplace, you can immediately look at how it can apply to you in what you do, to understanding what you do. Any kind of an activity or a department or a care system, you could understand it by looking at it in these categories. What is the structure involved? That is the resources. You saw Professor John's input-output kind of thing. Then you have the process, which is in the actual delivery of care. When you talk to the patient, when you take the history, when you measure the blood pressure and things like that, or when you give the medicines, all these things are the process of care. And to some extent, these two domains have been acknowledged, and it has been implemented through the accreditation process in the NABH. Traditionally, all of us have been trained to look at things in the level of the structure. How many doctors are there? How many nurses are there? So automatically you'll see when you shift to a process view, you're asking different questions, more or less in the case mix. I think I better put this off. It's showing something else up. It's showing a letter I wrote to you. Okay. Can we switch this off, please? I'll finish my thing quicker. Okay. Switch it off. Yeah. Switch it off. I'll just. And yeah, I'll just finish it. Yeah. Yeah. Here. Yeah. Okay, so I'll quickly have very little more to say, so that I will say it quickly. So you need to understand that the structure and process. So the process view is what case mix looks at. It wants to know how that thing is done. What is the components that are involved in what you're doing? It is later that idea is used for financing, to say that these are the groups, and these groups use a homogeneous level of resources. So at the level of process, you get that. But to do that, the focus is on outcomes. So any migration that is required, it is from process to outcomes. And to study outcomes, unlike to study processes and to study structure, which can be done in an isolated manner, you can't do it without an understanding of the mix of case or the severity level. And that is why you hear the word severity adjustment when you study outcomes. The second concept we have spent quite a lot of time, Professor John has spent in talking about costs. So even before this, I just want to say something. When you look at any process, if you're looking at any process, the idea of flow is very important. How do things happen over a period of time? The temporal nature of activity. That is exactly what is the definition of any process. Unlike structure, which is static, processes are by nature dynamic. So in that sense, you're bringing in the idea of time, and with that idea of time, you're also bringing in an idea of variation. So this idea of variation is very fundamental to almost everything that we do or analyze, whether it be the quality or outcomes, whether it be the cost that is happening. So when you talk about case mix or case mix measurement systems, you're trying to actually understand how the variation of cost is being explained by the variation in the case mix. So in another way, we can actually summarize this part of my presentation by saying that I'm just borrowing this word from somebody called Edward Deming, who is considered the father of quality. He said, variation is the enemy of quality. The idea of flow, again, is very, very important because it takes time and says what is the kind of optimization that is possible in any process when you're taking care of patients, when you're admitting patients, when you're transferring patients, how quickly do you do it and how efficiently do you do it. Now, this is actually, if you see, the domain of nurses. You end up doing it without getting credit for this, so much credit for this. That is the level of the role that nurses play that is central to the process aspect of care and to the outcomes of care. To some extent, one could say that nurses are the logisticians in the healthcare domain. They decide who gets admitted, who gets discharged. The decision is made elsewhere, but the activity as such. And therefore, it becomes imperative that you place more importance to the people who are at the coalface of care provision, who are really doing the work on a daily basis. When you take quality and when you take cost, so if you take quality, Professor John again stressed the idea that there's no point trying to control cost if you don't have a control over quality. And that concept is famously captured by the idea of value. So when you divide quality by cost, you get value. Now this idea of value has been with us for long, but there's one person who has actually, really bitten into it and refuses to, has sunk his teeth into it, and that is again the Harvard business professor Michael Porter. So